Well, this is right from the parliamentary budget officer's mouth. Canada's own emissions are not materially big enough to impact climate change. What that means is that even if you waved a magic wand and Canada didn't exist tomorrow, it wouldn't make a difference as far as climate change goes.
This is the Canadian Taxpayers Federation podcast, where we're dedicated to lower taxes, less waste, and more accountable government. I'm Chris Sims. I'm the Alberta director for the CTF. I'm holding down the fort here in Lethbridge, Alberta. My good friend Carson Binda, he's our BC director for the CTF. He's out there in Vancouver. Carson, I don't know if you're renting a basement tent or whatever, but your backdrop is looking really nice and sunny there. You did a really deep dive into the second carbon tax. So Prime Minister Justin Trudeau's second carbon tax, it's going to hit us this summer. Within the next 7 years, it's going to be costing Alberta families over here in this province more than $1,100 a year. But before we dive into all of the details about the second carbon tax, I think we need to back up for a second, Carson. Can you please explain to our listeners and viewers what is the second carbon tax and how is it different from the first one?
Yeah, thanks so much for having me on today, Chris. So the second carbon tax is a tax scheme by the Trudeau government that's going to kick in July this year. But it's a little bit different from the first carbon tax, and I think we need to talk a little bit about those differences.
Okay.
So the second carbon tax is going to require energy producers to lower the carbon intensity of their fuels, the gasoline and diesel that Canadians use to fill up their cars to drive to work and school every day. Now, if they can't meet those requirements, if they can't lower the carbon intensity of the fuels, they're going to have to pay the second carbon tax. They're going to have to give money to the government. And those companies, they're going to end up passing that cost down to consumers, to normal Canadians who are filling up their vehicles. Now, Chris, it's also important to note that this second carbon tax, it's not replacing the first carbon tax. It's being layered on top of the first carbon tax. And unlike the first carbon tax, where families get a little bit of money back in the form of rebates, there are absolutely no rebates at all for the second carbon tax. That means families in Alberta, like you said, are going to be paying around $1,000 a year for this, and they're not going to see a single dime coming back to them or their families.
Yeah, it's pretty brutal when you take a look at the numbers. I know I've gone over this over the past few years with Dan McTague. He's a really good guy on things like petroleum pricing, how it costs people money. He's with Canadians for Affordable Energy. And if you wanted to look up the formula, folks, you can Google it. But it's really complicated. It involves international purchasing of credits, all this stuff. What it boils down to is this. Is that it's going to cost you more to fill up with either gasoline or diesel. Now, I'm from British Columbia, not too far from where you're sitting right now, Carson, and BC has had a second carbon tax for years. And spoiler alert, folks, it's one of the reasons why gasoline hovers around $2 a liter in downtown Vancouver. So the second carbon tax there is a big deal. But Carson, you took a close look at this from the Parliamentary Budget Office, from this report. Federally speaking, okay, across the country, once Trudeau imposes this across the country, federally, how much is this second carbon tax going to cost people?
Yeah, by the time it's fully implemented in 2030, this carbon tax is going to cost families about 17 cents per liter of gasoline. That means your average minivan fill up, if mom's filling up the minivan on the way to soccer practice after school, that's going to cost about $13 more every single time you fill up the minivan.
Cool.
Now, the cost of diesel is also going up, but it depends a little bit where you are in the country, how much more you're going to be paying in this carbon tax. So the prairies, like with a lot of things this government is doing, are going to be hit the hardest by the second carbon tax. Families in Saskatchewan, where I'm from originally, they're going to be paying about $1,120 more per year on gasoline because of this carbon tax. Chris, in your neck of the woods, over in Lethbridge, across Alberta, families are going to be paying about $1,160. That's the highest price of the second carbon tax in the country. Here in BC on the far west coast, it's going to cost families about $400. Now, folks, you might be wondering why it's so much less in BC compared to the rest of the country. And Chris, like you already mentioned, that's because we have been doing this for years. We are already paying the second carbon tax provincially. So our big fuel producers are already paying into it. And it's a huge reason why gas taxes in British Columbia, in the Lower Mainland, in Vancouver, where I'm sitting right now, are about 78 cents a liter because of things like the second carbon tax.
Yeah, you nailed it there. And folks who haven't driven through BC and through Vancouver in particular in a while, like, just wait. Wait until you go visit this summer. Your eyes will pop out of your head when you look at the price of gasoline. It's a wonder anybody's able to make it out there. And what I found really interesting about this report, you and I were talking about this offline, is that the PBO does an even deeper dive into how the second carbon tax will affect different kinds of families. And so what that means is rich families, middle income families, poorer families. So Carson, you took a look at this for us. Let the listeners and viewers know, how will Trudeau's second carbon tax potentially affect Canadian families differently?
Yeah, well, the second carbon tax is going to make the poorest families in Canada even poorer. And they're the ones who are going to be impacted the most by the second carbon tax. Now, the parliamentary budget officer, he makes it crystal clear. I'm going to quote him right now. He says that the second carbon tax is, and I quote, regressive for households because, again, this is a quote, lower income households generally spend a larger share of their income on transportation and other energy intensive goods and services compared to higher income households. Now, that's a little bit of jargon. So let's talk about what that really means, Chris.
Yeah.
What that means is that families who are just scraping by, the poorest families in Canada, a bigger part of their paycheck goes towards paying for transportation. When you make less money and still have to do commuting, still have to drive your kids to school and extracurriculars, a bigger portion of your paycheck goes towards that if you make less money.
Yeah.
Now, richer families, they can drive the same amount, but it's a smaller portion of their paycheck going towards paying for energy. So this is something that's deeply wrong about the second carbon tax. It's deeply, deeply wrong to be pushing taxes that hurt the people who can least afford it the most. And look, we already see that with the first carbon tax. Yeah. Here in BC, the government went so far as to admit it in their budget and fiscal plan this year. BC's most recent budget says that single mother families and folks living in rural communities are already being hit hardest by the first carbon tax. So this is really just adding another layer of injury to families who are already being punished so harshly by that first carbon tax.
And you nailed it there, Carson. Well said. And I think this is something important for listeners and viewers and tax fighters across Canada to remember. The next time some politician in power opens their mouth to talk about affordability and sticking up for the little guy, think about the carbon tax. I remember when a gentleman named John Horgan was in the opposition benches in British Columbia, in Victoria, and he used to rail against the imposition of a British Columbia carbon tax. Back then, I think it was about 5 cents a liter. And he said that people wouldn't be able to afford to drive to work and that it would cost them too much to heat their homes when the wild West Coast winds were blowing. So it's really important to hold politicians accountable when they talk out of one side of their mouths about affordability, and then on the other, turn around and jack up carbon taxes on your essentials like grocery, transportation, and home heating. Now, another element of this PBO report was really important, and that's when they took a look at living rurally or in a small town. So keep in mind, folks, if you live kind of on the outskirts or if you live in a more remote area, especially if you're living up north, I happen to speak with folks up in Prince George and in your province quite often there, Carson, and everything up there is trucked up there or brought up on a train. Like diesel runs Prince George. They wouldn't have supplies otherwise. Guess what? The second carbon tax and the first apply to diesel. So that makes everything more expensive. So it winds up costing people in those areas even more money. Now, you brought up an element while we were talking off air that I was surprised actually to see the PBO touch on this. Can you talk about what they mentioned about the environment, about the impact of the second carbon tax on the environment?
Yeah, and I think this is one of the most important takeaways from the Parliamentary Budget Officer's report on the second carbon tax. The Parliamentary Budget Officer, and I'm going to quote him again here. Sorry, folks. I know.
No, it's important. You know, straight up, people don't have time to read this stuff. So it's really important for us to dive into it and like read it to them. So I think it's great that you took a close read. Go for it.
Well, this is right from the Parliamentary Budget Officer's mouth. Canada's own emissions are not materially big enough to impact climate change. What that means is that even if you waved a magic wand and Canada didn't exist tomorrow, it wouldn't make a difference as far as climate change goes. We are not big emitters here in Canada. We emit about 1% of the global carbon dioxide that's in our atmosphere. The big polluters, countries like China and India, they need to get their acts together if we're going to do something about climate change. Punishing Canadians for driving to work and school isn't going to fix the environment. And look, I care deeply about climate change and the environment. I live here on the beautiful and wild West Coast. Every day I wake up and see the mountains and the forests and the sea that makes British Columbia beautiful. If this was going to help the environment, that would be one thing. But the Parliamentary Budget Officer makes it crystal clear that this tax plan isn't going to do anything for the environment. And at the same time, the PBO says that it's going to shrink Canada's economy by about $9 billion. So this tax, it's a lose-lose on every level. It's a ton of pocketbook pain for those families who are going to be out more than $1,000 a year. And at the same time, it's not doing anything to meaningfully help the environment. And look, it's important for folks to remember that this second carbon tax is going to make gasoline and diesel cost even more. It's going to be imposed this summer, and within within the next 7 years, it's going to cost 17 cents more per liter of gasoline and even more per liter of diesel. Unlike the first carbon tax, where families at least get some rebates back, and these rebates aren't perfect for the first carbon tax, families get nothing back from the second carbon tax. So this is all take without any environmental gain, and it's going to do real damage to our economy. But at least there's one silver lining, and that's that it doesn't apply to home heating fuels yet. Let's not give the Trudeau government ideas. All right, Carson, thank you so much for taking a deep dive into the second carbon tax for us on this. Folks, if you don't want to be paying through the nose and punished repeatedly over and over again for driving to work, heating your home, and buying food, you know, the essentials of life, with no help for the environment, I'm encouraging you to pick up your smartphone or fire up your laptop, find the email of your member of parliament. Tell them that this is a huge voting issue for you. Tell them that you want to see both the first and the second federal carbon taxes scrapped here in Canada. If you need any help on writing your letter, or if you want to read some of our articles, there's tons of them on the carbon taxes and how much they cost you. Head on over to our website, taxpayer.com. Lots there to help you.